Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring your curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner of the Duluth News Tribune, and I will be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we take a look at how the local ties of train porters led to an incredible story. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. Here to help us learn more about a possibly less widely known part of railroad history and its connection to the Northland is arts and entertainment reporter Jay Gabler. Jay, it's good to have you back.
Glad to be back, Wyatt.
It's also good for me to be back. For frequent listeners, you might have noticed that for the first time in 80 plus episodes, I was absent for the previous episode. So special thanks to Dan Williamson for stepping in and filling in. I was, fortunately and unfortunately, I was on vacation at the time when we had to have recorded. So it was very kind of him to step in and kind of fill the roles for an episode. We'll try not to make a super habit of it, but I was very grateful that he was willing to hop in. I thought he did a great job.
Yeah, he can kind of be your like Joan Rivers, your guest host when you are off on vacation.
Mm-hmm. And now we're going from buses, and that episode is a bus-themed episode. I encourage you to check that out, to trains.
Absolutely. I've read so many Northland stories are about transportation, and trains in particular have a huge role in this region. So glad to be back with another train story.
Mm-hmm. And you're no stranger to working with Ken Bueller and such. Not that story's about Ken Bueller. It's just fun to point out that when we go on shoots a lot of times, but for Northlandia sometimes, that sources will ask you about your I know Ken Bueller pin that you semi-often have with you.
Yes, it's my little brag. I know Ken Bueller. It's a joke because a lot of people know Ken Bueller, but it is a talking point. And Ken helped us out with this story, welcoming us to the Lake Superior Railroad Museum and using his special museum director's key to let us into the car Northland, which is a Pullman sleeping car that is in the collection of the Lake Superior Railroad Museum that members of the public typically don't get to see. So it's really neat to be able to get in there and talk with Jerry McGee and capture some photos and video as well.
Mm-hmm. And now we've established you're no stranger to railroad stories in your job holistically at the News Tribune. But how'd you come across this story specifically to bring here in Northlandia?
This was kind of a wild story, how we were connected to this story. This may be the first article I've written at the News Tribune that came as the result of someone just randomly walking into the newsroom. It wasn't totally random, but we certainly didn't expect a woman from Arizona named Cheryl Gazdick came to the newsroom one day. I wasn't here. Our managing editor, Katie Roman, was. And Cheryl explained that she had come to the News Tribune because she was looking for a copy of an article that we published in, wait for it, 1964. So we don't have physical newspapers from the 60s sitting around the newsroom anymore, but there are digital archives now at newspapers.com. So Katie helped her access that article. And the article was about a woman named Rebecca Mills, who in the mid-1960s was quite elderly, living with her ailing brother on a farm in Ino, Wisconsin, which even people from the Northland might not know where Ino is. It's an unincorporated community right in the middle of Bayfield County. So Cheryl now lives in Arizona, but she grew up in Ino, and Rebecca Mills and her husband, who was already deceased by 1964, he died in the 1950s, had been friends of Cheryl's family. And she was back in the Northland from Arizona to pick up the belongings of Rebecca and John Mills. When Rebecca Mills died in the 1970s, there were no obvious family members to inherit her possessions, which then included the possessions of her late husband, John. So the Gazdick family, the friends of the Mills, took the several trunks of their possessions and just hung on to them, not quite sure what to do with them, but knowing they should be preserved for all this time, 50 plus years. And finally they're like, okay, we should do something with these besides just let them sit here in a basement. And it occurred to them that the trunks could have some historical value because, long story leading to the whole import of this story, John Mills was a Pullman porter.
And for those who don't know, who were Pullman porters?
I will defer here to Jerry McGee, who works as a car attendant on the North Shore Scenic Railroad here in Duluth today. And he is the author of a book called Working the Rails, a history of Pullman porters and their latter-day successors. So we talked with Jerry in the car Northland, which is a former Pullman car, would have been a car where Pullman porters would once have worked. Pullman was a company that manufactured and then would run sleeper cars. So they would build your sleeper car. The railroad would sort of run the rail line, but Pullman Company, apparently in many cases, would continue to manage the car. So they would take care of, running the car. That meant that the porters who attended people using those cars worked for the Pullman Company, hence Pullman porters. Here's Jerry.
The Pullman porter basically was a car attendant. So we all know car attendants. They turned the beds down, they cooked, they cleaned the cars, they were responsible for the cars. So there was always, like this one, had one porter that was responsible for the car. This was his car, and everything had to be ship-shape. That was how they were trained. So basically that's what they did. They don't call them porters anymore. They haven't called them porters since about 1964. The rest of the railroads had picked up most of the Pullman porters that were left, put them where there was a few of them that still were wearing porter on there, which the reason I wear a hat down there that says Pullman porter is because it's a classic railroad. So nothing more than having a classic character in there, because we've got our conductors and the people come on and immediately they think I'm the conductor. I'm like, no, I said I'm the porter, and basically that's what they did.
So did many Pullman porters live and work in the Northland? Looking for that Northland connection here.
There is that Northland connection here, not just because we have some of the historic Pullman equipment here in Duluth, but of course because of the Mills family connection. But no, there were not a lot of Pullman porters living in the Northland during the time when they, sort of were most numerous as employees of the Pullman Company. They would tend to live near railroad hubs. This was during the U.S. railroad boom. But, it was not unusual for there to be a story like the Mills story. What happened was John Mills, as a Pullman porter, would be on the train. He often would be on apparently the line going from Chicago, Illinois to Ashland, Wisconsin, which then, gets right up here into the Northland. And apparently John Mills decided, boy, this is some beautiful country up here in northwestern Wisconsin. And so he and his wife, Rebecca, decided to move here and settle in what was then, according to the News Tribune reporting, an essentially entirely white community. The Pullman porters, were largely African American, and so were the Mills. But they decided that this was, a community they wanted to live in, and were embraced by the community, including their neighbors, the Gazdicks. One of the people I talked to for this story was Dr. Lynn Hughes, who is the founder of the National A. Philip Randolph Pullman Porter Museum in Chicago. Here's Dr. Hughes talking about Pullman porters and where they lived.
When they first began working for the Pullman Company, they were African Americans who were newly freed slaves who had this opportunity that was mind-boggling to the African American community in general, that they now could ride the trains and travel, and the amount of money that they made afforded them the luxury of having a certain lifestyle that impressed other members of our community. And so they had very special characteristics. They were very family-oriented. They were adamant about educating their children. And they were people in the community, wherever it was, that they were highly respected. And so one of the things that I found out was that I just recall a large number of people in descendants from Minnesota, a large number of them in California, a large number of them in Texas, and they all seem to be in communities that were, in today's world, integrated, but they had lived there for decades. And so I think the influence of their environment on the trains and the things that they were exposed to broadened their horizons in a way that nothing was off limits, if you will, because they had determined that they were accepted. They had determined that they could live where they could afford to live.
Okay, so now that we have an idea of who Pullman porters were and where they were out of and where they lived and such. Who specifically was John Mills, and why was he so important?
John Mills is historically significant as one of the founders of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So this was the union, the labor union formed by the porters, and not only was important in railroad history, but also in U.S. labor history. It was the first black-led union to get an AFL charter. So really important part of history. And then furthermore, the people associated with this union, the organizing that happened to make this union happen, ended up becoming significant in the larger civil rights movement that was to follow. So a lot of important things happened involving the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Very important organization, and obviously a huge part of the story of Pullman porters, so very important to represent in the National A. Philip Randolph Pullman Porter Museum. So it turned out that when these trunks were opened, they turned out to have just a huge trove of documents that went back to the founding of this union. And Dr. Hughes told me these documents and other material from John Mills and his work, and then his wife, Rebecca, are really significant for this museum to have because they constitute a lot of tangible written evidence of how the union was organized, what kind of communication happened among the people who were organizing the union. And Dr. Hughes told me a lot of things that they knew about, that generally these were the kind of discussions that had happened, but some of it had just been word of mouth, that someone said, oh, I remember these kind of discussions happened, and now they've got documentary evidence. They can look at the actual letters that went back and forth among John Mills and other organizers of the union. So really historically important material. And John Mills was significant within this story. He was one of the porters living and working in the Chicago area. And so I mentioned the name of the museum is the National A. Philip Randolph Pullman Porter Museum. So A. Philip Randolph was, you could say, the lead organizer of the union and became the public face of the union. So became a really important voice for the porters in their work to be represented by a union, to, negotiate better terms with the company. And it turns out it was John Mills who was a really important voice in saying to his fellow porters who were organizing this union, you know what, I'll let Dr. Hughes tell the story.
Mr. Mills was a person who was from Chicago, and they went to a meeting that was convened in New York City, and A. Philip Randolph was the speaker. When they observed the content of his speech, which was very strategic in saying to them, you are always being watched, the Pullman Company is watching you, and if you're here, and they know you're here, and some spies are in the room, they're going to go back and tell them that you participated in the meeting. So you don't say anything. Just let me talk. Mr. Mills was in that meeting with a gentleman, a fellow Pullman porter, and he leans over and says to him, I think this is the guy we need to help us start the union. And as they say, the rest is history.
So how did the Mills and Gazdick families form such a friendship?
Dr. Hughes told me this was just an incredible story of the decades-long friendship between these families. So the person I talked to from the family, Cheryl Gazdick, was born in 1960, she explained. And so by the time she was born, John Mills had already died. Rebecca Mills was a widow living near the family. And the family, with other members of the community, were sort of helping to support Rebecca Mills living independently in her increasingly sort of aged state. And so Cheryl Gazdick would have just been a young girl, but she remembers going and other family members going to talk with Mrs. Mills to help her. So that was Cheryl's memory. But then the family's relationship with the Mills couple apparently goes back to the 1930s. So the Mills would have moved to Wisconsin in the 1920s, which was the decade when Cheryl Gazdick's father was born. And so as relatively, young men, Mr. Gazdick and Mr. Mills would have met each other and formed a friendship, So quite early on. And then eventually, Mr. Gazdick married, raised a family, remained in the community. And so the relationship between these families just sort of deepened over the decades. That was a great photo in the article, ended up being the 92nd birthday of Rebecca Mills in the 1970s. At the time, Cheryl Gazdick told me they called it the 99th birthday, but it turns out that when, a death certificate was created at the time that Mrs. Mills passed, it turned out that she was 92 years old at the time of her death. So quite a long, great life. So there's this photo of her birthday party. This would be the summer just before she passed. And there are just several people from the community just sort of around celebrating with her. And in that group are both of Cheryl Gazdick's parents. So just fun to see this, neighborhood, basically. It's more of a community because it's a more rural area, I gather. I haven't been there personally, not specifically to Ino. But yeah, just sort of all friends together celebrating this remarkable woman who had achieved this milestone birthday. I asked Dr. Hughes what her impression was when she first connected with Cheryl Gazdick and heard about this story.
The thing that really took my head to a whole nother place was, here was a woman who was from Phoenix, Arizona, whose family lived on the northern border of Wisconsin, who had some belongings of an African American who happened to be a friend of her father's. And the man and his wife both passed, and their belongings had been in the basement of this family for decades. It was just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it's crazy when you hear any story about that. I don't know. I feel like people can relate to. It's hard to hold on to anything, for such a long period of time, especially decades upon decades for that long.
Yeah, and it's, this story it's a national story. This is much bigger than the Northland area, but it is remarkable to think that this incredibly significant collection of documents and other material was just preserved in trunks in a family's basement in the middle of Bayfield County for half a century. And the family hadn't been quite sure what to do with them, but they knew that this material had to be preserved. And then for that material eventually to be connected with, exactly the right organization to preserve and celebrate this legacy is really, it's quite remarkable.
And how can people here in the Northland learn more about the story of Pullman Porters for those who are interested?
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm excited to go to the museum someday. I don't get to Chicago all that often. I should try to get there more often. But currently, the National A. Philip Randolph Pullman Porter Museum is under construction. But Dr. Hughes told me that when they reopen, they are going to be sure to have some of the materials from this Mills collection on prominent display. This is really remarkable material. So I would love to get down there to see the museum, which I've never visited, and to see this material, showcased there. So that's, if you can make it down to Chicago when the museum reopens, you can check their website for information on how construction is coming and all of this. Obviously, that's a fantastic way to learn about the legacy of the Pullman Porters. But yeah, here in the Northland, if you happen to be visiting the Lake Superior Railroad Museum or taking a ride on the North Shore Scenic Railroad out of Duluth here, you might run into Jerry McGee, who is one of the people working on the North Shore Scenic Railroad. And, he can tell you some stories. And his book is also available in the museum gift shop. So that's another way that you can learn what Jerry has learned about the history of Pullman Porters. When he works on the railroad, he says he actually wears a cap that says Porter, hoping to spark some conversations, hoping people will ask him about the cap, about the history of Pullman Porters, and he can, share what he knows. Here's what Jerry told us.
Most of the things people ask me, it's that type of a trip. They ask me, well, what did they do? And I explain them, and I say, and I tell them a few stories out of the book because I don't really want to give away the whole book. But, I tell them a few stories, and I said, here's the history that they don't teach you in school. We learned because we were in Chicago, but, up here, most of them had no idea it went on like that. And I said, well, history's never been pretty, So most of the people, it's usually railroad guys, railroad families, the love of railroad travel. Those are the guys that I get into talking. Most of them, it's like, wow, this is really great. You like your job? I said, yeah, as long as everything goes right. You don't really get into a whole lot of those conversations. I mean, I go around and I tell them when I come in, who I am and where the bathrooms are and, Some of them will, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago, a gal pulled me aside. She's like, well, yeah, she wanted to hear about these Pullman porters. I'm like, well, all right, sit back and relax. I said, this is going to be history that you didn't know anything about.
Well, I personally can't think of a better way to leave it off than with Jerry there. So Jay, thanks so much for bringing the story here. And before we wrap it up here, just want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything you're working on that you want to tease ahead that's coming out soon? Any articles you're working on?
Well, there's a lot of fun things I'm working on, and I will not give too many spoilers, but I will mention one of the reasons I was excited to come into the newsroom today. Of course, it was great to talk Northlandia with you, Wyatt, but I also picked up a book that arrived in the mail. It is a novel called Shoot Your Shot by Lexi LaFleur Brown, and it is a hockey-themed romance novel. Relevant to a future story, I'll say no more.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jay. Look forward to reading all about that. And listeners, you can probably find that story on DuluthNewsTribune.com.
Absolutely. That'll be more towards the start of hockey season. So don't look for it until September, but around then.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks so much, Jay.
Thanks, Wyatt.
And thank you for joining us in this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, see photos, and watch video produced by myself, visit DuluthNewsTribune.com/topic/Northlandia. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support us, consider becoming a subscriber to the Duluth News Tribune at DuluthNewsTribune.com/subscribe. Join us again next time and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss when on the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path in the rush to return, here in Northlandia.